Welcome to the Orchard Software podcast series, the LIS Connection. My name is Kim Futrell, and I'm Orchard's Senior Strategic Marketing Manager. This episode is called Why Your Lab Needs a Strategy for Value-Based Care. And so today we're going to focus on exactly that, how labs can develop a strategy that helps them contribute to value-based care contracts, such as Medicare Advantage. So I'd like to start with introducing our speaker, Matt Modleski. So Matt is Orchard's Executive VP of Corporate and Business Development. Matt is the perfect speaker for today's topic because he has experience in both of these subjects. Back in the day, he was at Stovall Granger Modleski, where they were consulting healthcare organizations about competitive positioning and strategy. And then later on in life, he worked at American Health Network, leading the operation of more than 70 physician practices dealing with value-based care. So welcome, Matt.
Kim, it's great to be with you. And I always start with Kim sort of expanding on her own introduction because she's such a star for Orchard. So Kim has run a lab, she's managed a lab, she writes our white papers, and always enjoy doing work with you, Kim. And this is no different. Really, really excited to do this podcast today with you.
Yeah, likewise. So what we want to talk about is how laboratories can leverage strategy to add value in a value-based care environment. But we hear those words all the time. We hear strategy, we hear value-based care, they're big, broad terms. So let's start with the strategy part and define that for us and set us up there.
Yeah, I think strategy is one of those subjects that if you had 10 people in a room or 20 people in a room and you said, hey, write the word strategy down and then write your definition behind it, we'd have 10 or 20 different variations of what strategy is. So I thought maybe to guide the conversation today, it would be worth pulling some quotes from some of the real, what we would call the geniuses of strategy over the years. The first quote's from Michael Porter, Harvard Business School. And one of the things he said that I think is important for labs to think about is to be different, you either need to do the same activities in a unique way, so the same things other labs do in a unique way, or you need to choose a unique set of activities that differentiate you from another laboratory. So I think that's kind of a good opening way to think about strategy and being different from your competition. And the next quote is from George Day, a Wharton business professor. And he said, the essence of strategy or competitive positioning is a theme that differentiates your business from its rivals in ways that are meaningful to the target customer. And I think we should take a pause there and say, okay, what does that really mean? And for today's discussion, what it means is take a giant step back from your normal business, your lab business, and look at the customers or the people you serve that send those orders to the lab. What are their businesses doing? And then even a giant step further back to say, what are their payers of healthcare, the people who are ultimately going to pay for the care, insurers or the government? What does their business require? And is there a way for our lab to differentiate itself in a way that's meaningful to one or both of those groups? And that's really the essence of what we're going to talk about today. There's obviously another father of strategy, Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War. And in The Art of War, Sun Tzu said, in order to be strategic, you had to understand self, other, and terrain. And really what that means in our world, we're not going to battle, so we're not going to study the mountains. But in the world of healthcare, the terrain can be very complex. The payer landscapes can be very complex. So today we're going to break that down a little bit, right? And we're going to talk about Medicare Advantage and value-based contracts, and maybe how to think strategically about differentiating your lab with that, terrain knowledge. So it should be kind of a fun way to work through how to think about strategy for a lab. We don't want to scare anybody, and we're not going to turn you into a Medicare Advantage, savant in 30 minutes. But I hope we can pique your interest to look for ways to differentiate the lab.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. So labs need a thoughtful strategy to differentiate them to the payers, to be more competitive. And, you and I have talked about this in the past, that we're all very good about talking about ourselves, but self, other, and terrain, labs really need to be stepping out those 2 steps and thinking more about that terrain. Is that a summary of what you said?
Yeah, that is a summary. I think we get very focused on talking about ourselves, and that's not just the lab itself, right? So when vendors come in and talk to the lab, they talk about turnaround time and efficiency and all things that are lab centric.
Right.
And what we really want laboratories to do is take those steps back and look at things they might do that don't seem obvious, if they're only looking inside the lab, that will yield tremendous value for their customers and ultimately for the lab itself if they'll look a little wider, open their apertures, good way to say it.
Gotcha. So in speaking about value-based care, we know Medicare Advantage is one of the fastest growing insurance types in the country. So explain the difference between Medicare and Medicare Advantage, and how Medicare Advantage is an example of a value-based care contract.
Yeah, so I think it is really important to understand the difference because it's fairly significant, and sometimes we just talk about them as if they're all the same. So the primary difference is the way the money flows from CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. In straight Medicare, there's a fee schedule that CMS publishes, and the providers provide service to those patients, those Medicare patients. They submit claims directly to the government, and the government directly pays them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's straight Medicare, right? In kind of the old days before Medicare Advantage. In Medicare Advantage, and this is really important, as the money flows from CMS towards the providers, it goes through commercial insurance companies, United, Aetna, Humana, and others who have Medicare Advantage plans. And it's where that money flows to the plan that labs and providers can influence to a great deal how much money actually comes down for patient care, and then can be shared with providers who are doing a good job on the quality side of taking care of patients. They can increase that amount of money. So we're going to talk about how that happens. It is worth talking about value-based care as a whole, in that there are 2 sides of the value-based care contracting world. One is the quality, which is what we're going to talk about here shortly, mm-hmm. improving or meeting certain quality metrics to improve the amount of reimbursement that you get as a provider group. The other is cost. Every value-based contract has a cost component, and you can provide value as a lab to either side of that value equation. And we're gonna give you examples at the end, customers of ours here at Orchard who are doing just that.
Mm-hmm. So Medicare Advantage is rated by stars, just like when we go to a restaurant, we give it 4 or 5 stars, right? So how does that star rating work, and how those are linked to specific measurements? So can you connect the star ratings in this picture?
Yeah, I think that's kind of really important to understand as we think about this from a lab perspective. So remember that the money can be increased, the amount of money that's flowing from Medicare to the commercial insurer who's going to adjudicate a Medicare Advantage plan. The star ratings have bonus payments attached to them if the mm-hmm. plan is a 4 or 5 star plan. So remember, Humana dropped last year from a 4 or 5 star down to 3.5, and it was in the news for a few days. The amount of money that changed in those plans for Humana was the equivalent to their entire profitability the year before. It was over $2 billion.
Wow.
And yeah, it was huge. So we're not talking about a little bit of money. We're talking about a lot of money. And we're talking about a lot of money because it's linked to all of the plan members. Mm-hmm. So as we think about the amount that CMS is paying the commercial insurer, and that amount's available now for patient care and to share with providers in value-based plans, the star ratings are how that per member per month, one of the ways that per member per month amount goes up. And if they fall below a certain threshold, it all goes away. So what happens is those star ratings have individual metrics assigned. So you might have a metric for diabetes, A1C. It might have another metric for diabetes, kidney disease, or I got one that I called up because I think it's kind of a different one to think about. Med adherence cholesterol. These are all measurements or metrics that are in the star ratings that then get cascaded down into a value-based contract with a group of providers.
Mm-hmm.
And if a lab's savvy about this, they can look at those measurements and go, well, gosh, that's all of our data. Why aren't we in those meetings? Or what if we knew more about how this actually works? Could we take information from our LIS or from some of the ways that we are measuring these things and provide more value to our customers, those that are ordering stuff from our lab? So it's tremendously important for laboratories to understand how those star ratings work and which measurements are being cascaded down to the providers using their lab, because there's tremendous value in understanding that and providing data back to those physicians.
Right. So if the lab understands what those measures are and then understands which ones they can impact, then they can really jump into this game and make a big difference. And you said $2 billion with a B, right? So this is a lot of money that and labs can have a portion of affecting this. So let's go to risk adjustment factors or RAF scores. And so how does that fit into the picture overall?
Yeah, so if we go back to the fact that the money coming from Medicare down to the commercial payer can be affected, one of two ways. The first way we just covered was the star ratings and the bonus payments. The second way that amount of money being paid to the commercial insurer who owns the plan and then can be shared with providers is something called risk adjustment factor, or RAF. And you hear that shortened all the time, right? So risk adjustment factor is driven by the appropriate documentation and supporting tests in a lot of cases to make that documentation stick, to say, how sick are my patients? Because we know that patients who have chronic disease require more resources, right? So this is the why behind why the system was designed that way. But what RAF is it's a numerical value attached to what's called an HCC. This is hard to say. Hierarchical chronic condition code. Yep.
Say that 5 times really fast.
I can't.
Hierarchical condition code.
Yeah, let's just call it HCC.
Okay.
But HCC codes have the numerical risk adjustment score attached, but ICD-10 codes that you would normally diagnose, or your physicians will, map to certain HCC codes. So that's kind of the way it works. Where the lab comes in is most of this documentation needs to be supported by a lab test or some sort of verification that patient really has that condition. And so if there's not appropriate documentation or a test result in support of the documentation that's in the charts, they won't receive that increased reimbursement. And it too can be a ton of money. I'll give you an example. Diabetes without complications. So that's HCC 19, HCC code 19. So if you have a diabetic who's documented as a diabetic with no complications, the risk adjustment increase in the payment for that patient is 0.121. So let's say the money flowing from CMS down to the commercial provider in a given market's $1,000 per month for that patient. For every patient who is charted and documented as a diabetic without complications, there'll be an additional $121 a month times 12 is $1,452 a year. Let's use 500 members, 500 plan members as our number. So you multiply 1,452 by 500, and you've got $726,000 increase for capturing diabetic diagnosis with no complications. So that's one number. Mm-hmm. The second number would be diabetes diagnosis with complications. That RAF is 0.374. And if you then looked at, well, what are the complications? And you could accurately reflect that a patient with diabetes, in this case, had vascular disease, that RAF's at 0.319. So if you add those two together, we're now looking at an increase in $693 per month for every member that's diagnosed, and the documentation supports that diagnosis. That comes out to, with 500 members, $4,158,000. So just quick math, 500 members in the plan, there's a net of $3.4 million. Now, people will say, well, does that make sense? And you go, well, if diabetic patients require more resources to be cared for, it certainly makes sense. And the incentives now that can be shared between the commercial payer and the provider group in one of those value-based contracts also goes up. So it should be good for patient care, it should be good for the providers who are doing the work, and it should be good for the commercial payer.
Right. I was getting ready to ask, how much money can a lab influence value-based care? And that was a great example. And at the heart of that is the lab getting the result that verifies that diagnosis, that justifies that RAF score and hierarchical condition code. So yeah, okay. So we've been
and Kim, I think it's worth thinking about this. You ran a lab, so if I'm a CMO and I come to you and I say, hey Kim, do you think we have a good picture of all our the kidney disease that might exist in all of our diabetics? Do you have any reports you could run that might show, how many patients we have diagnosed with an A1C, but we don't have a good kidney test on? Like, thinking about how this really works could open up some opportunity.
I could go run that report right out of the LIS. No problem.
Perfect. Well, then all of a sudden you start to help identify new opportunities and specific patients that we should bring in and test or get tested on their next visit. You become a consultant now for the way the business runs, which is really cool for the lab.
Right. Absolutely. So this is great information, great background. So we've been theoretical up to this point. So do you have some examples of laboratories that have actually succeeded in doing this, that understand this concept and have a successful strategy?
We do. It's an exciting time for labs if they'll take the two giant steps back. And I know it's hard to do because every day you're being asked for faster turnaround time and improve efficiency, and you've got staffing problems, and we get it. Like, there's a lot going on. But if you take these two steps back, here's a couple of examples that we have in our customer base of clients who have done just what we're talking about. The first one is really focused on the cost side of the value equation. So it's a large skilled nursing business. So they've got multiple facilities, and they never had a lab. And they decided for patient care, for the ability to have, faster turnaround times, that they wanted to put in a lab, and they bought a new LIS from us. So obviously we're aware of that. What was really cool, though, is shortly after they added the lab and the LIS, and they added microbiology, and that kind of got my attention, because microbiology is a perfect example of a type of test or type of result that can really yield getting a patient the right antibiotic quicker, maybe getting them out of that facility a day or two quicker. And it caught my attention because when I was at AHN, one of the levers that a medical group has to pull to improve the cost side of the value equation for their patients is how fast can they get that patient healthy and get them out of the skilled nursing facility. So this customer is using their lab to be able to discharge patients in a healthy way sooner, which is counterintuitive if you're just thinking about their business from why wouldn't I keep the patient right up until the money gets shut off? If I'm going to be paid 5 more days, but I'm choosing to discharge the patient it's like, why would they do that? The reason is now that skilled nursing facility can go out to the physician groups who are sending them patients and say, here's how we work with you to keep your costs low for your patients that get admitted to skilled nursing. It's really cool to demonstrate how to think differently about length of stay, think differently about the value of that lab and the tests they're doing. And now I'm getting more referrals in the front door because I'm affecting that customer's core business.
Right. And thinking about that from the lab manager perspective, we looked at volume. Do we have enough volume to bring in that test to make it profitable? And this is not necessarily a high volume test. This is the test that may be low volume, but it can affect that length of stay in a positive way. So it's a whole different way of thinking for the lab. So yeah, that's a great example. And I think you have another one to share with us as well, right?
I do, more on the quality side and kind of linked to the star ratings and RAF. So when Medicare Advantage first started picking up steam, maybe 5 to 7 years ago, I'm tossing that out kind of loosely.
Mm-hmm.
Some provider groups who had a large Medicare Advantage population already, and it was growing, jumped right on that bandwagon, and they figured that data was key. And so this particular client really began to educate their physicians, bought a new LIS that allowed them to capture more information and data, and integrate that data into the ways that they were going to report back to payers. And they began to really prove how good their work was in these measures that go into both star ratings and their own value-based contracts. And so they were so good at that, and they've created, they've added a data warehouse to their business. They're so good at it that the payer now has chosen to partner with that group and grow that business nationally. So here's a group that really kind of understood the terrain, started to do things differently, and report their results in a serious way to the payer. Now they're in business, growing that entire business nationally because they do such a good job. And so, again, it's an exciting time once we understand where the levers are and the role the lab plays, because the lab data is huge in terms of both star ratings and, in this case, risk adjustment.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, they really took the ball and ran with it.
They did.
So to me, this means labs really need to take those 2 steps back, be thinking outside the typical things they focus on, much broader, looking at that big picture. How can my lab affect things like length of stay, other factors that drive these ratings? So we probably have some labs who haven't thought down this way of thinking yet. What advice would you give to them? What would you say to them to help them get started?
Well, I think the first thing is, if what we've just talked about and what you heard scares you, don't let it, right? If you're like, oh my God, I don't want to learn anything about this, it sounds crazily complex. Here's what we used to tell our customers back in my old life. We'd say, let's eat the elephant one bite at a time.
Yep, I've heard that. Yeah.
So you've been immersed in this for years with me, and we've been talking about some of these things forever. But if it's kind of new to you, if the idea of HCC codes and RAF and star ratings and value-based contracts are all a little scary, here's what I want you to do. I want you to, in the morning or in the evening, with a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, I want you to commit to reading 1 article a day, no more than 5 minutes, on one of those 4 topics. Just pick it, read 1 article a week, and write 1 question down for your organization or for your customer base using your lab. The question can be for either one of those. 1 article a day, 1 question a day. Do that for a month, maybe 5 weeks. When you're done, you're going to know more about those issues than most people you'll talk to. And you could say, well, that's kind of sad, but it's not. It's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity. Now, if you're in a very progressive organization that's already talking about this and you've been in these meetings, et cetera, then still take a giant step back. See what else is out there that you could add value to if you were thinking more about the businesses that use your lab and less about the lab itself. There's always opportunity if you'll push back, take a giant step back.
Yeah. So yeah, I like that. I like your list. And most of the laboratory people that I know are lifelong learners. We want to learn what everything is about and how we can influence it. So just, I'm going to go back over your list. So we're going to read 3 minutes a day or evening with our coffee or our wine. We're going to read about star ratings, value-based care and Medicare Advantage, hierarchical condition codes, risk adjustment factors, and HEDIS. We didn't talk about HEDIS much, but that's, what is that? Healthcare Effective Data Information Set. You want to touch on HEDIS for a second?
Sure, because they're part of star ratings. Essentially, health plans are graded with HEDIS measures that have now been turned into star ratings. They're sort of one in the same. There'll be some HEDIS measures that aren't part of star ratings. There'll be some star ratings that aren't included in HEDIS measures. But essentially, it's a grading system for health plans, and they'll take the important ones out of the HEDIS set, and they'll be put into value-based contracts. But they'll look just like or be the same as the star rating components. But yeah, that's another place to read about. And again, that would be on the quality side of the value equation, but certainly something to read about. So yeah, add HEDIS to your list and round it out at 5 instead of 4.
Yeah. So there we go. You got your homework. And This was absolutely fantastic, Matt. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing all your expertise. And to our listeners, stay tuned for our next episode. And thank you for listening to the LIS Connection.
Kim, I enjoyed working with you as always. And I hope we've provided some insight for our customers. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.